October 12, 1944. Camp Roberts, Pennsylvania. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the prisoner of war facility as autumn leaves scattered across the compound. Inside, 23 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms hanging loose on frames that had grown thin over months of retreat and capture. They had been taken prisoner in France during the final Allied push, serving as communications officers, clerks, and medical assistants for the retreating Wehrmacht. Now they were being delivered into the hands of their enemies, and every one of them expected the worst. 26-year-old Greta Hoffmann pressed her palm against the cold metal side of the truck, trying to steady her breathing. She had been a radio operator in Berlin before the war reached its desperate final stages. The propaganda she had absorbed for years painted Americans as ruthless, particularly toward German women. Her mother's final letter, received months ago, had warned her that capture meant certain death or worse. Yet here she sat, alive but terrified of what awaited beyond those canvas flaps. Captain Helen Morrison watched from her office window as the truck came to a stop. She had overseen male POW camps before, but this assignment was unprecedented. 23 women, most in their 20s, all exhausted and malnourished from months on the run. She had received strict orders from Washington about proper treatment according to Geneva Convention standards, but she also understood that these women would arrive expecting brutality. The gap between their expectations and reality would be her first challenge. The canvas flap opened, flooding the truck bed with pale afternoon light. Sergeant Tom Bradley, a career military man from Ohio, stood at attention. "Ladies, please step down in an orderly fashion," he said in clear, measured English. His tone was neither friendly nor hostile, simply professional. The women exchanged uncertain glances, before slowly climbing down one by one. Greta was among the last to emerge. Her legs trembled as her boots hit the gravel. She looked around at the compound with its neat wooden barracks, chain-link fencing, and American flags snapping in the October wind. Everything was orderly, clean, almost suburban in its appearance. This wasn't the harsh prison camp she had imagined during the long journey from the East Coast Processing Center. Liesel Weber, a petite blonde who had served as a clerk in Stuttgart, stood beside Greta with her arms wrapped around herself. "It's so quiet," she whispered in German. "Where are the other prisoners?" The camp seemed oddly empty, designed for a much larger population than their small group. Captain Morrison emerged from the main building, her uniform crisp and her expression neutral. She surveyed the assembled women with experienced eyes, noting their hollow cheeks, the way their uniforms no longer fit properly, the exhaustion etched into young faces. Before she could speak, Marguerite Klein swayed on her feet and collapsed. The camp infirmary smelled of antiseptic and clean cotton, scents that seemed almost foreign after months of field conditions. Marguerite Klein lay on a narrow bed, conscious now but weak. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China 2 decades earlier, checked her pulse with gentle efficiency. "Malnutrition and exhaustion," she told Captain Morrison quietly. "Nothing rest and proper food won't fix." Greta stood near the doorway with several other women, watching this exchange with confusion. They had expected to be herded into cells, perhaps beaten for being enemy soldiers. Instead, they witnessed their unconscious companion being carried inside by American soldiers who handled her with care, treated by a medical officer who showed genuine concern. The dissonance between expectation and reality was disorienting. "The others need to eat," Lieutenant Chen continued, speaking to the captain but knowing the German women were listening. "When did they last have a proper meal?" Captain Morrison turned to face the assembled prisoners. "We're going to take you to the mess hall," she announced in slow, clear English. "You will eat, then we'll assign barracks and discuss camp rules." She paused, studying their wary faces. "You are prisoners of war, but you will be treated according to international law. That means adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Sergeant Bradley led the group across the compound toward a long wooden building. The mess hall was simple but spotless, with rows of tables and benches. The windows let in afternoon light that made everything seem almost cheerful. Cook Mary Patterson, a robust woman in her 40s from Nebraska, stood behind the serving counter with 2 assistants. She had been briefed about the new arrivals and had prepared accordingly. "Sit anywhere you like," Sergeant Bradley instructed, gesturing to the empty tables. The women hesitated, then slowly chose seats, clustering together at 2 tables near the back. They sat with military straightness, despite their exhaustion, maintaining what dignity they could in their circumstances. Private Daniel Cooper, barely 20 years old and fresh from his family's Iowa farm, helped bring out the food. The first tray contained thick slices of white bread, still warm. The second held a large pot of vegetable beef stew. The third brought butter, real butter, in small portions. The women stared at the food as if it might be an illusion. Anna Richter, who at 19 was the youngest among them, whispered to Greta in German, "Is this a trick? To make us grateful before they starve us?" It was a reasonable question based on everything they had been taught. Propaganda had painted Americans as wasteful but cruel, especially toward German prisoners. Cook Patterson noticed their hesitation. She ladled stew into a bowl, took a piece of bread, buttered it, and ate a bite herself. "See?" she said, though she knew most of them couldn't understand English. "Just food. Nothing special, but it's good, and there's plenty." The German women ate slowly at first, almost cautiously, as if the food might betray them. But hunger was a powerful force, and the stew was rich with actual chunks of beef, carrots, and potatoes swimming in thick gravy. The bread was soft, not the hard black bread they had subsisted on during the final months of their service. And the butter, real yellow butter, melted on the warm slices like something from a distant memory of peacetime. Greta found herself eating faster than she intended, her body overriding her mind's caution. Across from her, Liesel had tears streaming silently down her face as she chewed, overwhelmed by the simple act of eating real food. None of them had experienced a meal like this in over a year. Even before their capture, rations had been sparse and of poor quality. The contrast was almost painful. Frieda Schmidt, a former nurse from Munich who was 31 and the oldest among them, set down her spoon carefully. "This is more food than German soldiers are getting," she said quietly in German to those around her. "How can our enemies eat like this while we starve?" It was a question that struck at the foundation of everything they had been told about American weakness and German strength. Cook Patterson watched from behind the counter, understanding nothing of their words, but everything about their expressions. She had fed hungry people before during the Depression years, had seen that particular look of gratitude mixed with shame that came from accepting help from unexpected sources. She turned to her assistant and nodded. Private Cooper emerged from the kitchen carrying a large tray. On it sat 23 small glass bowls, each filled with dark, creamy chocolate pudding topped with a swirl of real whipped cream. He began placing them on the tables in front of each woman, one by one. The prisoners stared at the dessert in complete silence. Chocolate had become a luxury even for civilians in Germany years ago. For soldiers and auxiliaries, it had vanished entirely from their lives. The pudding gleamed in the afternoon light, rich and dark and impossibly indulgent. The whipped cream sat like a small cloud on top, a flourish that seemed to mock the austerity they had known. Anna reached out tentatively and touched the cool glass bowl as if confirming it was real. She picked up the spoon with trembling fingers and took the smallest possible bite. Her eyes closed. The taste exploded across her tongue after so many months of bland, minimal rations. It was sweet, rich, creamy, everything her body had been craving without her even realizing it. Then something broke inside the young woman. She began to cry, not quietly like Liesel had cried over the bread, but in great heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders. The spoon clattered against the bowl as she covered her face with her hands. Anna's crying triggered something in the others. Marguerite Klein, who had recovered enough to join them from the infirmary, sat with her own untouched pudding and wept. Frida pressed her napkin to her eyes, shoulders shaking. Even Greta, who had maintained rigid composure since capture, felt her throat tighten as she took her first bite of the chocolate dessert. It wasn't just the taste. It was what the pudding represented. Abundance in a world that had taught them only scarcity. Generosity from people they had been told were enemies. Dignity offered to prisoners who expected only cruelty. Cook Patterson came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She approached the table slowly, not wanting to startle the emotional women. "There's more if you want seconds," she said gently, knowing most wouldn't understand the words, but hoping her tone would communicate the meaning. She gestured to the kitchen, making a scooping motion. "More. Plenty more." Sergeant Bradley stood near the contact doorway, visibly uncomfortable with the display of emotion. He was a military man who understood orders and protocols, not weeping enemy prisoners transformed by chocolate pudding. But Private Cooper, younger and less hardened by military service, pulled out a handkerchief and offered it to Anna. She looked up at him with red, swollen eyes, confused by this small gesture of kindness. He simply placed it on the table beside her bowl and stepped back. Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself in different forms. The women were assigned to a barracks that, while simple, had real beds with mattresses, clean sheets, and wool blankets. Each bed had a pillow. These basic comforts felt like luxuries after months of sleeping on floors, in trucks, or in temporary holding facilities during their journey to America. Lieutenant Chen visited the barracks each evening to check on their health. She brought vitamin supplements and extra portions of food for those who were most malnourished. She learned to pronounce their names correctly, a small courtesy that none of them had expected. When Liesel developed a persistent cough, Chen brought her real medicine, not the inferior substitutes they had grown accustomed to in Germany. Private Cooper, who had grown up helping his mother tend to livestock and younger siblings, seemed to have an instinct for small gestures that eased the women's transition. He brought Anna a pair of thick socks when he noticed her shivering during morning roll call. He saved newspapers with photographs, understanding that even enemy prisoners needed some connection to the outside world. He smiled when he delivered meals, a genuine friendly expression that asked for nothing in return. Greta watched these interactions with growing confusion. She had been trained to expect American brutality. Instead, she witnessed something far more dangerous to her understanding of the world. She saw ordinary human kindness extended across enemy lines. Each small gesture chipped away at years of propaganda, leaving her uncertain about everything she thought she knew. 3 weeks into their captivity, the German women still ate in near silence during meals, but the tension had begun to shift into something else. They no longer picked at their food suspiciously. They no longer waited for others to eat first. Instead, they consumed their portions with the focused attention of people whose bodies were slowly remembering what adequate nutrition felt like. But they never asked for more, even when their eyes lingered on the serving dishes that Cook Patterson left on the counter. Greta noticed this pattern during breakfast on a cold November morning. The women had been served scrambled eggs, toast, and oatmeal with brown sugar and cream. Anna had finished her portion quickly, her eyes drifting toward the pot of oatmeal that still held at least 3 more servings. But she sat with her empty bowl, hands folded in her lap, waiting for dismissal. "Why, don't you get more?" Greta asked quietly in German. Anna looked at her with surprise. "We're prisoners," she whispered back. "We take what we're given. Asking for more would be ungrateful." Greedy. It was the mentality they had all been raised with. Scarcity mindset, rationing mindset, the belief that wanting more was a moral failing rather than a natural human need. Cook Patterson had noticed the same pattern. She discussed it with Captain Morrison during their morning meeting. "They won't ask for seconds," she explained, frustration evident in her voice. "They sit there still hungry, but they won't come up for more food. I've tried gesturing, I've tried putting extra portions right in front of them. They'll only eat what's placed on their plates initially." Captain Morrison considered this. "It's a control issue," she said finally. They've been trained to expect punishment for wanting things. We need to show them that abundance isn't a trap. She thought for a moment, then made a decision. At lunch today, I'll address them directly about it. The noon meal was beef stew again, this time with fresh baked rolls and green beans. After the women had been served and had eaten their initial portions, Captain Morrison stood and addressed the mess hall. Lieutenant Chen stood beside her, ready to translate the key phrases into German. "Ladies," the captain began, waiting for silence. "I've noticed that none of you ask for additional food when you're still hungry. I want to make something clear. You are prisoners of war, yes, but you are entitled to adequate nutrition under international law. More than that, we have plenty of food. There is no shortage. If you want seconds or thirds, you simply come to the counter and ask. Cook Patterson will serve you. This is not a trick. This is not a test. This is simply how we do things here." Lieutenant Chen translated carefully, watching the women's faces as comprehension settled over them. Several exchanged glances. Frida looked skeptical. Marguerite's expression showed cautious hope. For 2 days after Captain Morrison's announcement, none of the German women approached the counter for seconds. They ate their portions, thanked Cook Patterson with quiet nods, and returned to their seats. The invisible wall of pride and fear remained intact despite the captain's explicit permission. But on the third day, something shifted. Anna had been working on kitchen cleanup duty, a rotating assignment that all prisoners participated in as part of camp routine. She stood at the large industrial sink, washing dishes while Cook Patterson prepared ingredients for the evening meal. The cook was humming softly, a folk tune that Anna didn't recognize but found comforting nonetheless. When Anna finished the dishes and turned to leave, her stomach growled audibly. Lunch had been hours ago, and dinner wouldn't be served for another 2 hours. Cook Patterson heard the sound and looked up from the carrots she was peeling. Without a word, she walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a small bowl of leftover chocolate pudding from the previous night's dessert. She set it on the counter with a spoon and gestured for Anna to sit. "Go on," she said gently. "Eat." Anna hesitated, then slowly approached. She sat on a stool near the counter and picked up the spoon. The first bite was just as good as she remembered, but this time, instead of tears, she found herself smiling. "Danke," she said softly, one of the few German words Cook Patterson had learned. "Thank you." The cook smiled back and returned to her work. For several minutes, they existed in comfortable silence, Anna eating slowly to savor every bite, Cook Patterson methodically preparing vegetables. Then Anna surprised both of them by speaking in halting English. "My mother, she make pudding. Different. With vanilla and. She struggled for the word, finally making a gesture of something being poured. "Sauce?" Cook Patterson guessed. Anna nodded enthusiastically. "Ja, sauce. Vanilla sauce. Very good." Her face brightened with the memory, then darkened as she realized she was talking about her mother in present tense when she had no idea if her mother was even alive. The letters had stopped coming 6 months ago. Cook Patterson saw the shift in the young woman's expression. She set down her peeler and came around the counter. "Would you like to help me cook sometime?" she asked slowly, using simple words and gestures. "You could show me your mother's recipes. I could teach you American ones." Anna looked up, surprised by the offer. Cooking together seemed impossibly intimate for a prisoner and her captor, but it also felt like a bridge, a way to honor her mother's memory while learning something new. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I help." Word spread through the barracks that evening. Anna had been invited to cook with the American staff. Some of the women thought it was collaboration, a betrayal of their German identity, but others, like Greta and Liesel, saw it differently. They saw it as survival, as adaptation, as a small way to maintain connection to home while building something new in this strange place of unexpected kindness. December brought bitter cold to Pennsylvania and devastating news from Europe. The camp's small library received newspapers daily, and Lieutenant Chen had begun translating selected articles for the German women who requested them. Most of the prisoners wanted information about their hometowns, their families, any news that might tell them what awaited them when the war finally ended. What they discovered instead was a catalog of destruction that made their own uncertain future seem even more terrifying. Greta sat in the library on a gray afternoon, reading a translated article about the bombing of Berlin. Her neighborhood, the streets where she had grown up, the bakery her father had owned, all of it was described as rubble. The article included grainy photographs of women digging through ruins, searching for anything salvageable. These women looked skeletal, their faces hollow with hunger and exhaustion. They wore layers of ragged clothing against the winter cold. The contrast between their suffering and Greta's current circumstances felt obscene. "My city is gone," Frida said quietly from across the table. She held a newspaper with an article about Munich. "The hospital where I trained, the apartment where I lived with my sister, the church where my parents were married. All gone. What do I return to? What is left?" Her voice carried no emotion, just a flat acceptance of catastrophic loss. Liesel joined them, her hands trembling as she held her own translated article. "Stuttgart is 80% destroyed," she read aloud. 80%. That means my family's home is almost certainly gone. My parents, my 2 younger brothers, I haven't heard from them since May. The Red Cross has no information. She looked up at the other women with eyes that had cried too many tears to produce more. "How do I go back to a place that doesn't exist anymore?" The camp had recently allowed the prisoners to send letters through the International Red Cross, carefully monitored but permitted. All 23 women had written to their families. After 6 weeks, only 5 had received responses. 3 learned that their parents were dead, killed in bombing raids. 1 discovered her entire family had fled east, and their current location was unknown. The 5th, Marguerite, received a brief note from her aunt saying that her mother was alive but living in a displaced persons camp in the British zone. That evening, the women gathered in their barracks for what had become an unofficial discussion group. They sat on their beds, some wrapped in the wool blankets the Americans had provided, and talked about the impossible future that awaited them. The war would end eventually. Everyone knew that. Germany was losing, had perhaps already lost. And, when it ended, they would be expected to return home. But home was a concept that no longer seemed to exist. Anna, who had spent the afternoon helping cook Patterson prepare apple crisp for dessert, spoke up quietly. "What if we don't want to go back?" The words hung in the cold air of the barracks like a dangerous confession. Several women looked at her with shock. Others nodded slowly, relieved that someone had finally voiced what they had all been thinking. The question Anna had posed created a fault line through the group of German women. Some, like Frida, believed that returning to Germany was their duty regardless of what they would find there. "We are German," she insisted during their evening discussions. "Our country needs us now more than ever. Running away to stay in comfort while our people suffer would be cowardice." Her words carried the weight of traditional values, of loyalty and obligation that had been drilled into them since childhood. But others found themselves pulled toward a different possibility. Greta had been keeping a journal, writing in German about her experiences in the camp. In one entry from mid-December, she wrote words that terrified her even as she put them on paper. "I have been treated with more dignity as a prisoner in America than I ever was as a free citizen in Germany. What does that say about the country I'm supposed to love? What does that say about me that I would even think such thoughts?" The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. The German women were no longer treated as dangerous enemies to be guarded closely. They had been given responsibilities, trusted with tasks, included in daily camp operations. Anna worked in the kitchen 3 days a week now, learning American recipes and teaching German ones. Liesel had begun helping Lieutenant Chen with administrative paperwork, her neat handwriting and attention to detail making her invaluable. Greta assisted Sergeant Bradley with inventory management, her organizational skills proving useful. More importantly, they had formed relationships. Private Cooper had taught Anna how to play baseball using a stick and a rolled-up sock during their recreation time. Cook Patterson had begun calling Liesl honey, as she did with everyone she cared about. Lieutenant Chen and Greta had discovered a shared love of classical music and spent evenings discussing composers when duties allowed. These weren't the relationships of captor and captive anymore. They were becoming something closer to friendships. The announcement came in early January 1945. Captain Morrison called a meeting in the mess hall to inform the prisoners about repatriation procedures. The war was entering its final phase. Germany's defeat was now a matter of when, not if. Plans were being made for the return of all prisoners of war to their countries of origin. The process would likely begin within 3 to 6 months. You will be transported to processing centers on the East Coast, Captain Morrison explained, with Lieutenant Chen translating. From there, ships will take you back to Europe. You'll be processed through displaced persons camps and then released to make your way home. She paused, looking at the assembled women, whose faces reflected complicated emotions. I want you to know that you have been model prisoners. You've conducted yourselves with dignity, and you've contributed positively to this camp's operations. That will be noted in your files. After the meeting ended, the women filed out in silence. They returned to their barracks and sat on their beds, contemplating futures they couldn't quite imagine. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the camp in white. Inside, Anna looked at Greta and asked the question that would change everything. What if we asked to stay? What if we told them we don't want to go back? The idea seemed impossible at first. Prisoners of war didn't simply choose to remain with their captors. There were laws, protocols, international agreements that governed such matters. But Anna's question had planted a seed that grew rapidly in the minds of several women. Over the next 2 weeks, a smaller group began meeting quietly after evening roll call to discuss what had once been unthinkable. Greta, Anna, Liesl, Marguerite, and 3 others, Helga, Rosa, and Katha, formed the core of this group. They were careful not to speak openly about their considerations, aware that the other prisoners might view their thoughts as betrayal. But in whispered conversations after lights out, they began to articulate what they had been feeling for months. It's not about the food, Greta insisted one night, though they all knew the abundance had been part of their awakening. It's about being treated like a human being, like someone whose life has value. I never felt that in Germany, even before the war. I was useful, yes, but never valued. The others nodded in the darkness, understanding exactly what she meant. Liesl added her own perspective. My parents raised me to be obedient, to serve, to never question authority. Here, Lieutenant Chen asks my opinion about things. She asks what I think, not just what I can do. When was the last time anyone in Germany cared what I thought about anything? Her voice carried years of suppressed frustration with a system that had never seen her as anything more than a function. Anna, the youngest, had perhaps the most practical concern. I have no family left that I know of, no home to return to. Why would I go back to ruins and starvation when I could stay here and build something new? Is that selfish? Maybe. But I want to live, not just survive. The decision to approach Captain Morrison required courage that surprised even themselves. On a cold morning in late January, the 7 women requested a formal meeting. They stood in the captain's office, nervous but determined, while Greta served as their spokesperson. Her English had improved dramatically over the months, and she chose her words carefully. Captain Morrison, we understand this is unusual, she began, her accent still heavy but her meaning clear. But we want to request consideration for staying in America after the war ends. Not as prisoners, but as people who want to start again. She glanced at the others for support before continuing. We know what waits in Germany. We know we should want to return and help rebuild. But we have found something here that we never had at home. Dignity, purpose, the possibility of becoming more than what we were told we had to be. Captain Morrison sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated many things during her tenure as camp commander, but not this. "You understand what you're asking is unprecedented," she said finally. "There are legal complications, immigration procedures, public opinion to consider. Many Americans would be outraged at the idea of enemy prisoners being allowed to stay." The months that followed were filled with uncertainty and bureaucratic complexity. Captain Morrison had forwarded their request up the chain of command, noting in her report that these 7 women had demonstrated genuine transformation and posed no security risk. The response from Washington was cautiously open. Given the unprecedented circumstances and the chaos expected in post-war Germany, the women could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. But they would need sponsors, employment prospects, and community support. Word of their request spread beyond the camp. Local newspapers picked up the story, running headlines that ranged from sympathetic to skeptical. "German prisoners choose America over homeland," read one. "Enemy women seek new start after war," proclaimed another. The coverage brought both support and criticism. Some community members saw it as a testament to American values of redemption and second chances. Others viewed it as rewarding the enemy while American soldiers were still fighting in the Pacific. But something remarkable began to happen. Cook Mary Patterson was the first to step forward, offering to sponsor Anna and provide housing while the young woman sought employment. "That girl has a gift in the kitchen," she told anyone who would listen. "And more than that, she's got a good heart. She deserves a chance." Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, a local school teacher who had begun visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, offered to sponsor Liesel and help her pursue education. Private Cooper's family, when they learned of the situation through his letters home, extended an invitation for Greta to come work on their Iowa farm. "We need help, and Pa says anyone who can organize a military inventory can certainly help run a farm operation," Daniel wrote to her. The offer came with housing, fair wages, and the promise of a community willing to give her a chance to prove herself. The other 4 women found similar opportunities. Chaplain Robert Hughes connected them with families and organizations willing to serve as sponsors. What had seemed impossible months earlier was slowly becoming reality, not through government mandate, but through individual Americans choosing to extend compassion to former enemies. The Repatriation Day arrived in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's final surrender. 16 of the original 23 German women prepared to return home. They had chosen loyalty to their homeland despite the devastation that awaited them. The 7 who had requested to stay stood with them at the processing area, helping pack belongings and sharing tearful farewells with women who had become sisters through their shared experience. Frida, who had been the most vocal about the duty to return, embraced Greta before boarding the transport truck. "I don't agree with your choice," she said quietly in German. "But I understand it. Maybe someday, Germany will be a place where women like us can feel what you've found here. Until then, someone needs to go back and help build that Germany." She pressed a small photograph into Greta's hand, a picture of their entire group taken at Christmas. "Don't forget where you came from. Even if you're building something new,